Fantastic. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Care in the Midst of Crisis. I'm going to start by opening us up in a word of prayer, and then we'll do introductions. So I'd love it if you join me in prayer now. Oh, gracious and holy God, for this chance to gather in person and online to hear how you are working through so many people, through the speakers, through the workshops in this conference. It has been enriching. It has been life-giving. It has been a breath of fresh air for me, and I pray that that's been the case for everyone who's gathered together here in this space. Gracious God, may your Holy Spirit move. May we feel you filling us with ideas, filling us with where you're calling us in our communities, where you see our churches moving and serving your people, where our role is in all of that. Gracious God, thank you for this chance. May you speak through us in all that we do here, and may we be a blessing to one another. All this we pray in your Son's holy name. Amen. Amen. Before we get started, Pastor Darrell here has reminded me that you can submit questions online through the app. So if you have access to the app and you have a question that you'd like us to address at the end of our presentation, feel free to use that app to submit your question. And I believe you don't need to have been signed up for the workshop. You can go ahead and access it. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the app. I'm Pastor Claire Saunders Clough. I am the Care Central Lead Director, so I oversee care throughout all of our locations, and it's a joy to be with you all this afternoon.
Okay. Well, my name is Wendy Lyons Crosstech, and I am here at Resurrection. I'm the Leawood location pastor, and that is a new role for me. I've been in this role for just about 3 months, and prior to that, I served as the Senior Director of Congregational Care, and so a little bit of what Claire is doing now, but it was different because we went through a transition here at Resurrection, and but I have served at Resurrection. I've been here for 12 years now and have always served in care and have just love the opportunity, the blessing, the gift that it is to be able to connect and care with others.
Thank you. And I am Anne Gatobu. I am the Executive Director for Locations and Care here at Church of Resurrection. I get to work with these amazing people and another whole team of group of people. We are so glad that you are here and that you've chosen to be part of this workshop. When we began to wonder what would be a good thing that we can present in just 1 hour in terms of care, there was so much for these 2 years. I mean, it's like, okay, what direction do we go? And so where we landed, as you will see, it's almost an eclectic way of coming together in terms of care for crisis. So we thought we are going to pull in some of the literature on crisis for us to begin to understand that, but also be able to pull in how we have set care ministries here at Resurrection, and then how has the literature on crisis been able to inform us the adjustments that needed to be made in order to be able to do care during unprecedented times that we have just experienced. So for us to begin to think about that, I'm going to pose some questions for you that you can begin to think about, and they are right up there. And if you're joining us online, I hope that you get to really feel part of this team and part of the group that we are here today. So the first question is, what challenges have been there for you in your own personal life in the last 2 years? And we reference the last 2 years because you all know what we have been through and still have not yet emerged on the other side, right? So what has been challenging for you at a personal level? And the second one, what has been challenging for your care ministry? Whatever that care ministry is in your place where you minister, what has been a challenge for you during these 2 years because of what we've gone through? And then the very third question I would like for you to be thinking about is, has the pandemic been a critical period or was it a crisis? That's a fun question. Was it a critical event or was it a crisis? And these are some of the questions I would like for you to hold during these all sessions, because they will come to bear in some of the materials that we get to present to you. They are supposed to help us articulate the critical events that we are referring to in the last 2 years on a personal level, as well as communities of faith. And they might begin to explain some of the levels of stress that we've experienced, dissonance that we may have experienced, helplessness, general feelings that cannot always be explained in what we are doing, or that may not be explained by any particular event that we may have felt. So the goals of our time together are going to be, one, I hope that by the end of this, we will be able to distinguish between critical event and a crisis. Critical event and a crisis. Second, we are going to learn the nuts and bolts of how Resurrection has built its care ministry. And third, I hope that we'll be able to demonstrate developing skills in crisis assessment and adjustments that we need in order to provide effective care ministries. So generally, these are our goals for this session together. I invite you to hold especially that last question in mind for the rest of the workshop today, because it has the gist of how we respond effectively. But before moving into getting to know how Resurrection has built and how Resurrection responded during times of crisis, let's jump into the very first goal of being able to distinguish between critical event and crisis. I want to propose to you that for any critical event to actually be termed as a crisis, that not everything that happens to us, however bad that might be, however horrible it might be, whether it is the loss of a loved one or what has happened, not everything is a crisis. All of them are critical events, but not everything rises to the level of being a crisis. And that for something to actually become a crisis, it has to go through 4 different phases that are up there for you. So let's look at the first one. So for any time for us to have a crisis, there has to be an event, something that happened, a precipitating event, so to say. It may be one incident, or it might be an accumulation of incidents, with one that maybe triggers the critical condition that made us move to a place of crisis. But still important, there has to be clarity of what that precipitating event was. So sometimes, for example, in the last 2 years, it's hard to tell, was it COVID? Was it the racial tensions? Was it the job losses? Was it all the other implications that came with all these things? Sometimes it's hard. And so how do we try to pinpoint on what the actual precipitating event was? Sometimes the precipitator itself may not even be identifiable. So someone may come up to you and tell you, I just feel disorganized, I feel a sense of dissonance, I'm not the same, I'm not thinking straight, I don't know what is happening. So they are not even able to tell that there's something that happened in their lives. So it is not always easily identifiable. Part of this process is trying to help that person know what is the precipitating event. The second phase of this is the appraisal. Appraisal here are meaning, the meaning making. We are human beings and we make meaning all the time, whether we know it or not. So something happens to me, I try to make a meaning about what has happened. So let's say, God forbid it, I lose my job. I have to try and make meaning, why did I lose that job, right? Is it because I suck? Is it because... Trying to use an American phrase. By the way, you can tell. If you haven't told, I'm originally from Kenya, okay? So what is it, what kind of meaning am I making? Is it God teaching me a lesson? Is it because I neglected something? We are meaning-making creatures. That's just how we are built. That's how we are wired. And that's what I'm calling appraisal. Now, this is a really important phase because the meanings we make actually have huge implications about if a precipitating event is going to rise to the level of becoming a crisis. So if I made the meaning that I lost a job because I suck, guess what? I have just threatened my sense of self-being. It has become a threat to me, and that's going to cause anxiety. That's going to cause disequilibrium in me. and most likely that's going to lead me to a crisis. But if I make the meaning that it's because my boss sucks, guess what? It's him or her. It's not me, right? I can move on. I can be able to go look for another place because I'm all good, right? So it's a meaning I'm making, and that will make me look for another job immediately. Can you see the difference? Just the meaning that we make, and we are always making meaning when something happens to us. Next to that, when whatever meaning we make, if we begin to feel anxiety, if we begin to feel disequilibrium, we begin to search and to reach out for coping resources. We don't tell ourselves, I'm now going to look for a coping resources. We just do it. For some of us, it may be something like a run. For others, it might be speaking to somebody else. If I'm seeing a counselor, that may be going to my counselor. If I'm good with my pastor, that might be reaching out to my pastor. It might be reaching out to my spouse. It might be reading a self-help book. Whatever that coping resource is, that is what we do. Now, if the coping resource works, and maybe that coping resource might help us revise. I'm sorry, did I just lose? Okay. If that coping resource works and it might help us revise our meaning and put us to a better positive meaning frame of mind, then the crisis is abated. And we are no longer going to be in a crisis, right? And it is now a critical event. And guess what? We know how to deal with critical events because we can do matrices, we can talk with people, we know what we have done in the past because it's a critical event, we can attack it, we can overcome it. But if the coping resources fail, remember coping resources are not always positive. Sometimes we grasp at the wrong coping resources. Might go to drinking, might go to some really bad things that just help us escape. And they help us escape for just a short while, and then in the morning we wake up and guess what? That thing is still there, we still have to deal with it, we still have to deal with the anxiety, nothing is changing around us, right? And it is at that point when the coping resources fail that we are plunged into a crisis. I hope what I've just described helps you distinguish between a precipitating event or a critical event and a crisis. And these are two very different things because sometimes we as caregivers tend to intervene in situations that are critical events, but we tend to intervene as though they were a crisis. And when we do that, in fact, we might be moving those people to plunge into more of a crisis. So how do we know if a situation has become a crisis? It is often complex and difficult. A crisis will confront us with choices. When you're in a crisis, you cannot just sit back unless the decision is to sit back. We find that we have to either find help, find ways to cope or to manage with it, or give up. So even giving up is a response. And crisis situations, because it is not a place we want to be, when one is experiencing or dealing with a critical event, they can manage it, they can wing it, they can still be able to attack it. But when someone is in a crisis, even the most effective CEO you know, maybe who is handling a huge organization, when that person is in a crisis, they are in a place where they don't want to be. It's a very hard place to be. They'll try to find quick fix as much as possible. I want you to know that crises are normal human reaction to hazardous situations. People are not crazy when they're in a crisis and begin to show symptoms like helplessness, anxiety, mobilization, confusion, somatic complaints, dependency, infantile clinging. It's not that the person is going crazy. In fact, there are some situations that plunge people into a crisis, and if they are not showing signs of a crisis, something is actually wrong with them. Because this is a normal human reaction to a very hazardous situation. Crisis is also accompanied by very emotional disequilibrium or disorganization that sometimes is expressed as feeling of intense anxiety. I don't know what's happening to me. I can't think straight. I'm just not myself. Those are the kind of expressions that you might hear from people. Crisis also embodies both an opportunity for growth, but also for danger. Once you're in a crisis, you are not going to be the same. For many people who have been in a crisis and have gone through it, these are the people that you'll hear have begun very altruistic opportunities. People will go out to change the world so that no one else gets to do that. Many of the foundations you hear are people who have gone through a crisis and want to do something good. So there's an impetus for growth. We are no longer the same. Some people, for them, it is the spiritual measure, the spiritual faith within them that grows, so that they are a different person in that way. Crisis will therefore present the seed for growth, but at the same time, it's an impetus for danger. There are people who never recover from that crisis and can actually lead to the mental health, can lead to them completely shutting themselves from faith and issues of faith, can lead to broken relationships because of the crisis. So it is kind of being on a leverage, and it could go either way. And this is why proper intervention is so important, so that we can help people be able to navigate through that critical event time. But I also want to say that crisis is very time limited, very small window in which we can intervene, and we have to make the best use of it. Because if we miss that window, and I'll talk about that window in a short while here, we may actually not be able to help that person be able to move on. One of the things to say is we cannot assume that we know the meaning that the person is making. Unless you actually talk with the person, help them process it, that's how you know the meaning that they are making. And also, we cannot tell the perception of what has been threatened unless we talk with them. The whole thing about counseling, the whole thing about talking with someone is trying to help them process and trying for you to help figure what kind of meanings are they making. Also, what cognitive map or set of expectancies about life have been violated. I talked about the meaning of why I lost my job, and how what that meaning could be a sense of self-threat, or as Janoff Bowman may also say, there are three major things that are violated: sense of self, or benevolence of the world. The world is no longer a benevolent place, so it's not a good place I want to be. Or the meaningfulness of the world, when we cannot make meaning of why what happened, then it threatens meaningfulness of the world. And if you're tracking, those are three things none of us wants to live with. I don't want to live without a sense of self. I don't want to live in a non-benevolent world. And I don't want to live in a place where things are random, because the world is not meaningful, which means it can happen to me at any time. One of the most important concepts in crisis literature is what we call heightened psychological accessibility. It's all about vulnerability. People in crisis are less defensive, more vulnerable, and open to change than any other time. So it might be somebody, for example, who never wanted to come to church, has nothing to do with church. When they're in a crisis, they might be open to, I might want to come to church. They might be influenced by the things that you try to tell them because of what we are calling the HPA. HPA is a very important concept, but it is abused a lot of times. Because we know someone is vulnerable, we might end up misusing that time and kind of filling the gaps that they are trying to make meaning of. And remember, we are filling them with our meanings, not their meanings. And that can be very, very dangerous, because they will not live in this HPA space for a long time. When they get away from it, when they get out of it and realize what you are doing, they will feel manipulated. And that may actually be the thing that pushes them away from faith and from anything you're telling them. So very important to be aware of this window. I tend accessibility has important implications then in how we do intervention. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance at this time, loosened boundaries. So if you visit a family who has lost a loved one, I mean, as a pastor, you can almost direct them in almost any way. They are like, okay, because they no longer have those boundaries. They have been loosened, and they are just vulnerable. They are ready to go with what there is. This period peaks very quickly and comes down very quickly. So important to make the best use of it. In addition, sometimes our own religious, apart from just the emotional and physical instability, our own religious faith sometimes is questioned and challenged. Crisis raises deep existential questions. It is the encounter of the contradiction between what we think we know and the reality of what we are experiencing at that time. It raises issues and questions of faith, but it may, as I have also said, be a space for us to be drawn to faith. So at this point, I'm going to give it over to Claire and to Wendy.
Thank you so much, Anne. Well, I just feel like I know that you'll have an opportunity to hear more from Anne, and she'll have more information to share. But as I was listening to that, I mean, how many people do we feel like in our congregations are likely going through crisis or have during this time? You know, many of them. So even just the way that Anne is framing that is to think about, how might we help people? How might we be able to provide care, and what might that look like? So as Anne was sharing in the beginning of our conversation, part of what Claire and I are going to talk about is how might we share with you the ways that we have served in ministry here at Resurrection and how care has started. And so I'm going to start off with a story and as well as a scripture. And so the thing that I will share is when I was at my last church, so I've been here for 12 years, I served at another church for 3 years, and I can remember a moment, so there was a sort of joke, when my senior pastor went out of town, always 2 people died. They died right before he left and right before he came back. And I remember thinking like, oh my goodness, like Jim's going out of town, there's going to be a loss in the community. And there was one particular situation where I was preaching that weekend. There was a loss there was someone who had passed away, and I had 2 funerals back to back, and I was preaching. And at the end of a long day, I was exhausted. So I preached on Sunday morning. I don't know if you've ever been the kind of tired, bone tired, where like I have nothing left to give. And so I was crashed out, exhausted on the couch, and I knew that there was a staff member whose loved one was near the end of life. And I didn't know that in fact, that her sister would pass away that day. So the family called, but I had my phone nowhere to be found, and my husband, who was caring for my mental and physical well-being, did not let me answer the phone. And then I was woken up about an hour later by someone knocking at the door saying, "We need you." And to this day, I'll share, I let that member of the congregation down. I wasn't there when she needed me to be. And here's what I look back in my own perspective and say, what could I have done differently? I was a member of a congregation that had at least 3 retired pastors, 2 of whom were district superintendents, which Pastor Ann was as well, and very much would have been happy to either take one of the funerals for me or they could have pulled out an old sermon and preached a sermon on my behalf, because if I would have simply asked for help, I would have received it. But because there was I was new in ministry, and I didn't want to mess up, I didn't know, I didn't think to ask for help. And because of that, I caused hurt and pain to someone else in the moment that they really needed it. So this passage of scripture from Exodus has been one that I have come back to time and time again to remind myself of the value of surrounding yourself with people who are here to help. It says, Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out." I'm going to say that again. You will surely wear yourself out. I saw the statistics. A lot of us might be finding ourselves in that situation. So I'm just saying that and letting that sit with you. Both you and these people with you. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. You should look for able people who fear God, are trustworthy, and hate dishonest gain. Let them sit as judges for the people at all times. Let them bring every important case to you, but decide every minor case for themselves, so it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will go to their home in peace. So as we talk about what this ministry looks like, it is an opportunity for you to share the load. But as Claire and I are talking about, and as Anne is going to talk about too, it's not just sharing the load. It is so much bigger than that. It is an invitation for people to do the very thing that God has called them to do. It is an invitation for people to love, to care for, and to engage in relationship with people who are in deep need. And so think about what might it look like for you to do this. I need the clicker. Sorry. Then my question is, why wouldn't you want to implement this program? So I can sometimes think of things and reasons why I might not want to do it, but you're going to have your own. One of them might be, I don't have the time to train somebody. I don't have the time to get a system up and running. There's no way that I can do this. Another reason is, what if they mess up? What if they don't give as good a care as I would, and they let somebody down? I feel like I'm letting my church down. What if the reason is, I don't know if I can get buy-in from my congregation, So there are all these reasons why we shouldn't. And so even just knowing that those are there, write them down. Think about them. And then as you're beginning to dream about why you need it, let go of some of those things. We're not going to be able to necessarily fix all of those, but at least knowing that they're out there, knowing that there are going to be resistances and challenges that you're going to experience will help you then find opportunities to press through and say, in spite of all that, I still need to do this. We talk about what it means to make a change, and when we want to make a change in our life, the pain of what we're experiencing right now has to be greater than the pain that we'll experience when we offer the change. And so we have to reach a point in our life where we say, I can't do this anymore. And sometimes maybe that's a lower threshold, or maybe you don't need some big precipitous event to make it change. But we have to come to a place where we say, I can't do this anymore, and I don't want to do this anymore. So therefore, I'm going to proceed and move forward.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I get the privilege of speaking as both pastor and as someone who's received care from a lay person. So I'll just jump right into my story. So that is my sweet little daughter, who is now doing fantastic. This February, she was born at 30 weeks. And we were not prepared for that. I was actually teaching a grief class and was like, man, I don't feel very good. And this was our precipitating event, if you will. She's doing fantastic, so I want to lead with that. But I can tell you that as a pastor, I can remember where I was sitting when my DS at the time, when Ann called me. I recall very vividly her phone call. And I remember where I was when Wendy called me. And it's powerful. You want to hear from your pastor. You want your church reaching out to you. And you want to have that care. And I'm going to cry because I love these people. And they were with me in life. And I craved the text messages I got from the mom in our congregation who had had a baby in that same hospital a year before, who'd had a preemie, and she knew the doctor's names, and she knew the medical lingo that I didn't know, and she reached out to me, and you know what? Some of her prayers were probably ones that my seminary professors would have said, we probably shouldn't use that phrase, right? And some of the theological language were things that at the time I was like, probably wouldn't have used that. In the moment, it didn't matter, because she said, how's that sweet baby girl doing today? And she knew, and she got it. And so I just want to say, as someone who received care from a layperson in the congregation, it is profound, and it is enriching, and it is amazing. And I'm regretting that I didn't put a follow-up picture, because she's a chunky little nugget now, so I wish I'd done that.
Follow you on Facebook or
Yeah,
Instagram.
find me on
Get
Facebook.
to see
Absolutely.
sweet Adeline.
Absolutely. And all of this happened in the pandemic. And so as we're talking about nuts and bolts of building this program, maybe it's this time that's the catalyst you need to say, what does it look like to invite people into care? Because lay folks, all of you lay folks in the room, God has given you experience, God has given you wisdom to bless your community and bless your congregation. And so maybe now is the time to really lean into a model of engaging. So we're going to talk about some practicals of what that looks like.
Yes. So we're going to start with 9 months out, but you might be like, I can't wait 9 months. But we're just, for those of you who are the planners in the room, any planners in the room, any planners online who are like, I need a plan. So we're going to give you one, and you can take it and throw it out the window, but this might be a helpful place to start. So we're going to really start with evaluate your congregation's needs. So everybody might have something different, you know. So I didn't get an opportunity to hear it, but Rebecca Chow, who's our director of counseling ministries, who's so incredibly gifted, was just doing a presentation on mental health. It's coming, friends. It's coming. Right now, we think it's hard, but the mental health needs are coming. Is it grief in your community? Is it marriage struggles? Is it whatever it is? What is the thing that you think, more than anything else, this is what my community needs right now? And just begin to address that and say, how are we going to tackle that?
Absolutely. And I'll just briefly state, come up with a job description. So maybe you don't need volunteers who can do everything. Maybe you have really specific needs in your church community right now. So put those together in a job description, put it on paper, get it out of your brain of what is it we both most need for our community, and then what does it look like to find those people? I just want to keep showing her. Sorry about that. So what does it look like to search those folks out? And putting into writing your theology of care. What is your why? You know, sometimes if we're inviting people into ministry, it can feel daunting if you're like, I want you to do a hospital visit. Like, whoa, that seems really terrifying. But if the why is, I want you to make profound connections with people who are sitting next to you in the pews, ooh, how do I do that? Sign me up for that. So for us, the model we've often used the language of stretcher bearer. So if you look to the story in the New Testament of the friends who carried their friend to see Jesus, that's language that we lean on a lot. So that's where our theology is grounded. So maybe there's a scripture that you would lean upon. What is your theology of care? To put that in writing, I think that could be really helpful.
So then as you begin to make some of these plans and get things set in place, you want to be able to garner the support of your church. So go to whether that is your church council or your governance body or other staff members or whoever that might be and get support. And one of the most profound ways to do that is by sharing a story. So what is somebody already doing? Like, how can you name the fact that, oh, you know, the Sunday school class, when Susie Joe had a hip replaced, they lined up a meal train for the next 6 months, maybe not 6 months, I don't know, you know, like, but they lined up a meal train. And then when someone's mom passed away, they delivered flowers, and they just, even if it's small things, whatever it might be, you know, I've had opportunities. I preached this past weekend, and I shared this story of Ann Williams, who's a fellow pastor. There's another Ann Williams who's not the same Ann Williams, but so fun also. But she, my daughter had ear tubes placed in her ears last Tuesday. It's a really minor procedure, but I was freaked out about it. And she called me and checked in with me. And then she showed up at the hospital on Tuesday morning with her 2 boys as she was preparing to go drop them off at school, just to be present and pray with me. And I will tell you that I have given care to a lot of people, but you feel it, you receive it, and you're like, oh man, she didn't have to be here. She just chose to be. And I would also go above and beyond to say that when a congregant shows up for someone, if you can say, they're not getting paid to do this, they're doing it because they want to, there's also something really powerful about that. So if you can convince your people to say, like, how will it feel if someone else shows up because they feel called to do it, then you will find an incredible community of people who want to join you.
Absolutely. And as Wendy said, you've got those folks already. These are the people who are calling you and saying, did you know so-and-so is going through this? Like, you can identify the people who want to be involved in this, even if they don't know that that's their title yet. So find them, have them, meet them for coffee, have an interview with them to get to know them. I mean, make those personal invitations. And you'll find those folks. For the sake of time, I'm just going to briefly say we follow Pastor Karen Lampe's The Caring Congregation. There is an updated version. This one is going out of print. That is Pastor Karen Lampe and Pastor Melissa Gepford. We follow that really fully for our training. So I'm just going to refer you to that. And as you're leaving this space, there are handouts I think you can grab over here on the whatever that game table is called. So we'll invite you to grab those. Those are some resources we have for you. The Caring Congregation actually has a virtual webinar coming up in October, so I'll point you to that. And we have some other resources that we use in training that I'll just invite you to grab on your way out. You are welcome to those.
Awesome. Again, for time, because there's always lots of great things to share. But I will say this is a time, organization, for you to just really think about what are some of the things, processes that you need to think about. We'll have a handout available for you to talk and think about prayer requests. How will I navigate prayer requests? What will that look like? What if there are financial concerns that come into the church? How might I provide support for them? Setting up a structure. So saying, how am I going to connect with these people? Again, I'm a planner. Like, just put it up. A failure to plan is a plan to fail. Okay. So saying, when's the next meeting going to be? And when are we going to do the follow-up? And when we're going to kind of walk through some things and just begin to populate meetings on the calendar, times you're going to train the care ministers, the times you're going to have conversations with them and follow up with them. And then ultimately trying to decide, what are the limits that we have? Like, we can't do it all. So what are the things that, as you begin, we're going to do this thing really well, or we're going to do this thing really well, but we can't do both. But how might you set a plan for eventually to that opportunity when we get to be able to share that? The last thing that I'll share is being able to, we're about to launch this thing. So what does it look like for you or your senior pastor or someone else to preach into what this might look like for your congregation? So you've kind of done all the background work. I'm like talking with the leadership, I'm talking with the people, I'm getting it all ready, and then I'm going to inspire the congregation so that not only do they want to receive care from others, but maybe there's somebody in the room who's like, I want to do that too. So we've got a little video, I think, we're hoping it works. We've got a little video that we've used in the past to share the profound impact that a care minister has on other people, but not only that, the way that they feel blessed when they're offered the opportunity to care for others. So take a look.
Our family was going through a very difficult situation. Things just kind of kept piling on, and it was one of those situations that was a few years long where it was one foot in front of the other every day.
2006, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease.
Stage 3 colon cancer is not, it's heavy. It's heavy stuff. And being a young mother at the time, I was 36 years old, and there was some really dark days.
I think sometimes joy is hard for us to see in the Christian faith.
When you're in the weeds and you get a call from somebody that has been there, it lifted me, and in ways that I didn't know could be done at that time, and it just gave me hope.
And it just moved me so greatly that all these people came and served me.
I said, when I get through this and when I'm strong enough, boy, I'm gonna get out there and I'm gonna help other people.
The church called me to call on someone that was going through cancer, and I made my first hospital visit, and I remember just, honestly, I never thought that I could do that.
That's an awesome honor to carry someone's burden.
If I can help anybody in their time of deepest need, even if it's just to hand them a tissue, I am so blessed to be able to do that. This ministry absolutely changes people's lives. It changes our lives as the congregational care ministers, and it changes so many lives of the people that we get to walk with.
There is a calling for you in your life to do good things. And so being a CCM for me is my silver lining, because it makes me know now that something so wonderful has come from something pretty bad.
We may not know how we change somebody's life. We just know we're trying to bring the presence of Christ into a situation.
As long as you have air in your lungs, you have a purpose in this life.
So you could even borrow that if you wanted to use that in your congregation. But as we begin to transition this back over to Pastor Ann, I would invite you to just think about most of the people in that video were describing a crisis in their life and how someone supported them, helped them through that crisis. And then they had an opportunity to find meaning, to give back, to change someone else's life. And we are in a place where people may be needing care and support, but maybe they've come through the crisis and they're like, I want to help somebody else now. I want to be the person who helps them to find strength and hope in the midst of what has been a really challenging time.
Absolutely. In my life, seeing that video every time, knowing I'm enriched by being paired up with these volunteers. And so my life in ministry is made better because of them. And looking forward to hearing from you again.
So now you already have a care ministry that is set up, right? You've gone through all the planning and everything. How do you assess someone who is in a crisis, someone who is a critical event, so that we can do the most effective intervention? We talked about the symptoms of one who is in a crisis and what they will manifest. Maybe at this point is to point out what, for somebody who is actually facing what could have been a crisis, but it is a critical event to them, to that person. What kind of, am I able to move? Okay, great. What kind of characteristics are they going to exhibit to show that I'm actually, okay, I'm coping with this. It's hard, but I'm coping with it. If someone is actively exploring their issues, maybe getting on the internet to search more about it. Maybe somebody, like you have heard those testimonies, has been diagnosed with cancer, but they've not gone and pulled up the blanket and not getting up. Instead, they are being active. They want to know more about it. They want to search for second opinions and all that. That's someone that's actively engaging that event. They are not in a crisis. If they are freely expressing both positive and negative feelings and tolerating their frustrations, that person is dealing with a critical event. They are not in a crisis. Is they are breaking down problems into manageable bits and trying to work them one at a time, they are not yet in a crisis. They are still dealing with a critical event. And it makes a huge difference. If they are self-aware of their own fatigue and tendencies towards disorganization, all those things that we lined up as the symptoms, if they are aware of that, that's someone that is dealing with a critical event. They are not yet in a crisis. I keep on wanting you to hear that crisis is a response. It's not the actual event, okay? It is the response we have. If someone is mastering their feelings where possible, accepting that what they are feeling sad, that sometimes they are crying, and that's okay, they are still dealing with a critical event. If they are trusting in themselves and trusting others, which means they still have a sense of benevolence, they still have a sense of a meaningful world, they still have a sense of self that is still good and positive, they are dealing with a critical event. So that is what separates between one in a crisis and one dealing with a critical event. Now here comes the question, how about the pandemic? Was that a crisis? Was it a critical event? I wish we had all the time. I would have wanted to break us in groups so we can actually talk about that. But let me just give us more rundown of how the pandemic began for us. And I want you to remember, as I'm talking about the pandemic, it's not the only thing that was happening. We were having all these racial tensions. We were having lots of political strife. We were having, so much that has been going on with us. And then there's all the other personal things that we cannot talk of as corporate, right? And then in the midst of that, the pandemic. But it was not a pandemic. It didn't begin as a pandemic. I don't know if you can rewind back to, I think it was around January, February, and we had in the news, somewhere in China, they're experiencing this thing, this horrible virus, right? And what was our response? It's too far away. That's not about us. That's about China, right? We are not even worried about it. And then New York, it's coming home, right? We begin to have some anxiety, but depending on where we are, if you are from New York, maybe at that point it begins to hit you. But for those of us in the Midwest, in the Great Plains and other places and way west, that is still far and removed. And then we began to hear a number of deaths, not in China, but here in the US. And all of a sudden it began to be real for us. I don't know about you, but every time I would open that news, instead of listening to the news, I think it was always those numbers were right on the bottom corner of the TV, right? And that's where my eyes always went. It's like, oh my goodness, this is happening. And then at that point, I think that's when it was named as a pandemic. But still, we did not have a case in Johnson County where we live, or the Wyandot County, or the surrounding county. And when it came, it began to become real. But it was still not in my family. I still did not know somebody who had had COVID, right? But then it actually began to grow right here, and then we had the mandates for masks, stay-at-home mandates, and all of a sudden, it's beginning to hit us. Now, if you remember what I described about the meanings we are making, the coping resources, right? All these things I'm describing, it's far away, it's not us, I don't mingle in those kind of circles. Those are all still part of the coping resources, which means it doesn't happen to people like me. It doesn't happen in my family. But then when it became a crisis, one of the symptoms, hoarding of toilet paper, right? You wonder why. I don't have the explanation for that. But by that time, it became a corporate crisis for so many people. And when it is so many people, then it can become a communal crisis and move from just the individual crisis. So given all the above characteristics of people that cope effectively and what happened, was the pandemic a crisis? Was it a critical event? I'll let you answer that for yourself. And for some people, it has never been a crisis. But for so many people, it was a crisis to the point that we could have called it a communal crisis at that point. So what adjustments did we make here at what has just been described in terms of the care we give in order to be effective with the people? I would want to categorize this in two ways. We tried to affect people's perception. Why is that? Remember stage number 2 of crisis progression, of an event progressing to become a crisis? So if you can affect people's perception, help them process it in different ways. 1, you are abating a crisis. 2, offering coping resources. And these are extremely important because maybe the role of the church in doing these two things, and when I say the church, I don't mean just resurrection. I'm sure if we had all the time, we could hear wonderful things that your churches, your communities of faith were doing during that time that affected these two areas, that affected people's perception, so that people still had a sense of self, people still thought the world was a meaningful place to live, people still thought that the world is a benevolent place to be. And maybe other things that you were doing offered people coping resources. So here are some of those that we were doing here at Resurrection. Constant messages of hope, sermons, written cards. How many cards were being written in phone calls?
Many, many thousands.
Thousands.
Easily.
I mean, at that time I was not even on staff yet, but I remember all the staff at CALL, for example, being assigned people to call, throughout that time because people could not come. And then countering messages of disregard with messages of cheer and gratitude, especially to our health workers. That happened a lot. And Claire?
I'm happy to speak to this one. This was getting at the perception piece. Our senior living community residents were literally alone. They were in their rooms without access to anyone. And so we had volunteers who went out and you can tell people are wrapped up in blankets. They did socially distanced worship services and connection. And then the next photo, I think, is the similar situation where we had volunteers who just made signs and stood outside of windows and said, we know that you feel so alone in this moment, but we are telling you that we care and we love you. And so we couldn't go in and visit. We couldn't do the things we wanted to do, but we could change that perception and say, nope, we see you and we love you.
The other piece of that you might imagine is for the healthcare workers who, before there was a vaccine, they had no protection, or they even had very limited protection, and they were overwhelmed and exhausted and scared. And so we would go to the parking lot and we would have these like honking parties where we would honk in the middle of shift changes just to say like, hey, we see you, we're acknowledging you, we're grateful for you. And then I think we've got one more. We also made some signs, and we encourage our congregation to make signs and place them everywhere, put them at hospitals, give them to people, and pass them along as reminders, physical, visible reminders that we cared for them.
And if I could add just 30 seconds right there, talking about your how the community perceives you. So we were at Advent Health. That was the hospital where we were in the NICU for 2 months, and we wore Church of the Resurrection masks, and that was pretty much all we did because we were trying to take care of ourselves. And the nurses said, "You're that church that honked for us 3 months ago. You're that church that took care of us." And so we had the reputation in the community, and they took better care of us because we had taken care of them 3 months before. So it affected me in a profound way.
And so here your efforts to change the perception of a community, so to say. So if whether that is the caregiving community or whatever community that you are trying to change the perception of, because you're not sitting with each person and being able to process. That's another thing that is just outside our home. I've had that board, the board, maybe you can't see it from that far, but it says, love your neighbor. And these were produced en masse here at CORE. And they were almost in every corner, wherever you went, anywhere in Kansas City. I bet even outside of Kansas City, you'd find one of these signs at someone's home. And this was really to counter the perception not only of the COVID, but of the racial issues, as well as of the political divide that was happening. I still have that sign because it means so much to me. And my hope is that anyone who passes through there can have some of their perception affected in one way. The second one that I talked about is offering of the coping resources. We had amplified opportunities for worship. So where worship used to be maybe Sunday and Wednesdays, I'm sure many of your churches have done the same. You have some Tuesday things. I think we have Tuesday Vespers that our senior pastor does. And just we've gone online, doubled online. We've gone to the TV just to make sure that people have access to worship as a coping resource, to the sermons as a coping resource. Outpouring of physical and financial resources. I cannot tell you the amounts of food supplies and financial assistance and counseling referrals and just really wonderful things to say, here we are. If you need us, we are here to help. We are here to be physical help for you.
And here's another example of volunteers going to what was a retirement community and saying prayer is vitally important and we can't be with you in person, so we're going to pray with you through a window. And here's a few of our care ministers. There was no pastor present at that event. They organized that themselves and let us know after the fact, and the activity director took photos inside. So that's what it's like to deploy volunteers who are passionate and called. They do profound ministry that I couldn't have even dreamed.
And as I end, let me also say, we've just talked about the things you can do for other people, blah, 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 and all that. How about you? What are the characteristics of someone that is centered enough to be able to give that kind of care during a time of crisis? Your own personal characteristics matter, so knowing thyself. Where are your boundaries? Where are your limits? What are your giftedness? Your own poise? Are you the kind of person that walks into a place and injects anxiety? Are you the kind of person that is going to be a calming presence? Creativity and flexibility. Critical times demands this. So, like I said, you've already been given the nuts and bolts of how to set your own program. You may have to throw that program out like we did so we can speak with people through the windows. It's not the sitting with somebody anymore. Energy. Where do you find your energy? Try to nurture that. quick mental reflexes to be able to respond to people, courage, hope, reality orientation, capacity to live with ambiguity. I think that's one of our biggies. How are you able to live with not knowing what tomorrow holds or what tomorrow is going to bring? And then, last but not least, cross-cultural competence. When we really want to care for people like Jesus cared, we are not going to care for people who look like us or who speak like us or who think like us. How are we prepared for that? What can we do in order to develop ourselves in that way? We still have only 5 minutes to be able to answer questions.
And I would just I want to just circle back to two things that Anne has said as a reminder. This is one crisis, but you may experience something else in the life of your congregation. And so reminding ourselves to how can we affect perception and how can we provide coping resources, continuing to find opportunities to do those things. So just wanted to circle that back around. Daryl, do we have any questions?
Well, actually, you guys did a great job because of the questions that were turned in. You have just about answered all of them.
Okay.
I'm going to speak to one of them that
Okay.
specifically asked about language that we use around masking and things like that. And I was going to point out to our guests, they can look at the signs we've got up on our doors right now to see how we're telling our congregation we're not requiring masks. Pretty much all of us as staff are wearing them because they've asked us to model this, and that's one thing to remember is modeling.
And well, for some of our locations, it is required. So if you were in the
Yes.
Kansas City area, and I believe in Blue Springs as well,
Across the state line.
across the state line, there are some requirements. But for those that it's not required, then we are asking people, and as you might expect, some people take this well and some do not, and so trying to connect with them and have loving and caring conversations with folks. So.
I will add for our care ministers, we have invited them and asked, not invited, we've asked them, if you're visiting with someone as a sign of hospitality, we ask you to wear a mask. And so we have made some distinguished choices in that.
Yep. And
Yes.
we made a mistake. We did not introduce Daryl. Daryl, would you like to introduce yourself so that you can continue the questions?
Well, I work on the adult discipleship staff here, and I get to serve these wonderful pastors who do such great work for us. No, but honestly, I mean, questions about how do you start a ministry and how do you make people aware of taking care of their own safety while caring for the safety of vulnerable people. You guys have already spoken to all of those questions, so thank you for doing a
Amen.
great
That
job.
means we can take one more question, right? Yes.
So, how do you recommend to your congregation? How do you recommend to your congregation that they seek or refer someone to pastoral care? Do they contact one of you all, or do they seek you out individually and they just know personally to seek help? Does a Sunday school teacher refer them?
Okay. Who wants to answer that? Any of us can do
Great
that.
question. We have a few avenues. I would say one of the biggest places we get the requests for care is through our prayer requests. So we have a process where people can say, I'd like someone to connect with me about this prayer request, and that's where we do a lot of our matching for care ministers. And people email us directly, people reach out through the website, so we do our best to collect all of those, but feel free to disagree, but I would say the prayer request is probably where we make a bulk of our matches on that.
Agreed.
And then when it is not like worship time to be able to offer a prayer request or anything like that, you can always go online, and there's a place where you can submit help or a prayer request or whatever else that you might be needing. Right now, actually, as we are in the midst of reorganization, we are trying to figure out how to do this across all our locations in a way that anybody from anywhere can be able to request for help and be able to find timely help. One of the things that I would like to add to what you presented as the way that Resurrection has built the care system is just a change of name. We are now going to be moving, we haven't even done that yet, but we are talking about moving from calling our congregational care ministers to connection and care ministers. The reason being, we want people to really be able to make connections, at least with people within our congregation, so that that kind of a thing is easy, that they are able to know